there, welcome back. Replacing the reprehensible films top 10 this week is This Is Not a Horror Film. Now, this was inspired by something in the Chris Mohan podcast, where basically we're talking about The Exorcist and why it's not a horror film. So, my number 10 is The Exorcist. As this is not a horror film, because it's one of those things that's like, yeah, it's bloody well a horror film, but it's a horror film that the director says it's not a horror film. But the categorization of this is not a horror film is different from, it's more complicated than that, because Kim Newman Nightmare movies had a whole thing about nightmare horror films more than just the tawdry horror films that you sometimes see. There were some good ones and bad ones, but there's also a variation of different types of horror, which if you read written horror, you also know. So something obviously a horror film that's more supernatural than Halloween or any of the Friday the 13th films has to be a horror film. It's just that's a genre. It doesn't mean it's not other things. It is a family under crisis movie, it is a look in faith, but it's a horror film also. I mean, it relies on basically, The Exorcist, for me at least, relies on two performances to get it through, which is Ellen Burstyn and Jason Miller. Other actors do their bit. Some are overrated for what they do, and some are, Max von Sydow was a great actor, but he didn't have to do much in that film, really. I mean, Linda Blair had a lot of prosthetics on a lot of times. She was good, but there was lots of help there. It's really relied on Jason Miller and Ellen Burstyn for that film to work. So there's a lot of things in that film that aren't horror based exclusively, but you need, in a lot of horror that works, you need performances like what Jason Miller and Ellen Burstyn did, and it is a horror film, but there's lots of other things there too. So this list goes into what's a horror film. Actually, it's a horror film, it takes part of the genre, but it also has other things in it that you can say, oh, that's different from what we can cast as a horror film. But it's really not, because horror is much wider than a lot of simplistic definitions implies. A lot of time people just lazily go for it's a horror film because it does this and this, and if it doesn't do that, it's not a horror film. It's like, no, there's lots of horror. So that's why this list exists. So now, number 10 is The Exorcist, since it was inspired by this, by Chris Mohan. Number 9, Dead Ringers. Now, Cronenberg's done a lot of films that are classed as horror, so I thought I'd choose one that's not classed as horror, but it's still using the same beats, which is Dead Ringers, which followed on to The Fly. And it's an existential horror film. It is about acting, it is about the mood. There is one or two dream sequences in it, but they're just to set up the unease of the situation. And it's still a horror film. It's still a sense of biology is destiny. Basically, these two guys who are twins, who are tied to each other in ways they can't quite explain. And it is a horrific thing about existence and eventual death and eventual, you rise and you fall, and the sense of the horror of where life's eventually going to take you, that relationships are only transitionary, really, ultimately. It's like, what is your relationship to your family? What's your relationship to yourself? And what's the internal human relationship actually like? All this stuff's horror, but it's also other things too. There is existentialism going on, but isn't existentialism kind of horror in lots of ways? It's based in a sense of horror about life. We don't like to say that, because it's respectable. Okay, number 8 is Badlands. Another one where it's like, oh, that's a social commentary about something that happened in Texas. Yeah, but it's also horrific. And it is the horror of this voiceover of Sissy Spacek talking about this guy who's a serial killer, who goes around killing people, who's a complete lunatic. And this film is far more horrifying by what it says about society than most horror films. Because it's like, there are plenty of these young girls who think the most banal stuff is genuine wisdom. young guys, the same, which you see with Martin's character. This is legion in society. You don't have to be young to think this. They can be old and think this nonsense a lot of the time. They can be middle-aged and think utter nonsense a lot of the time. And it can create so much damage. It's like, what's scary about human nature, and it's like how insane people can be, and how they cannot accept reality at all. And that's scary. That's scarier than Friday the 13th. When you run into people who are a bit off, it's scary in a way that most horror movies can't really approach. So Badlands is creepy as hell, and it is a horror film. It's just not a traditional one, but I would still class it as horror. Number 7 is Pan's Labyrinth. Pan's Labyrinth is a Guillermo del Toro film. Now, he's done horror films. This one was thought of as a dark fantasy, but it's a dark fantasy about a girl escaping into a fantastical world to escape the horrors of fascism in in Spain in the 30s. It's horror. It's horrific. Fascism is horrific. The things you have to do to escape fascism, the things that fascism does to people and what they do to other people is horrific. That film's scary. I avoid that film because it's scary. I don't watch it very often because it is creepier than most of Del Toro's films that are supposedly horror. You know, because this is a horror film. It's just, but it's because it's so respectable you can't say it's a horror film. But it is. It really is a horror film. It's a horror film the same way as Devil's Backbone's a horror film. But Devil's Backbone is allowed to be viewed as kind of a horror film, but a ghost story. This one is like, not from Del Toro, but from some critics, it's like, oh, it's not a horror film, it's a dark fantasy. No, it's a horror film. Really. I mean, has there been any horror film in the last few years as scary as Pan's Labyrinth? I don't think so. Number 6, Taxi Driver. I mean, really, it's about a psycho in New York in a taxi, going around having weird fantasies, doing the voiceover, telling you what they think. And how is that not horrific? How is that not terrifying? Oh, because it's socially relevant, it's not a horror film. Bullshit. It's scary. And what's scary is a lot of people who watch it identify with it when they're younger, and they don't know the utter horror because they have still in that mode of not being able to dislocate. It's about human emotions that are ugly and horrible. And that's what happens with a lot of films that show you what the human emotion is. They're castigated for showing those emotions because no one wants to deal with them. Look, I mean, recently David Fincher get hit for Fight Club for showing the kind of craziness of a certain kind of subset of culture. And it's like, that culture exists. It would exist without Fight Club, it exists with Fight Club. It's an example of the culture, it's not a glorification of it. And same with Taxi Driver, it's showing you something goes on, every male knows goes on, and just showing you for what it is. But it's a horror film. It really is a horror film, because it's scary as hell. And it's stuff that people have things in their head that they do not like about themselves, and this film is like the uber thing about that. Okay, number 5 is Deliverance. It's the horrors of nature. It's terrifying about going to nature and finding yourself everything out of control. It's an example of what happens when the machines shut down. And that's what Burt Reynolds' character something very about. What happens when everything shuts down? Can you survive? But this film is actually the horrors of that. Like, when everything shuts down, the bullies come out, and people have to behave in ways that are horrific to them, and the thin veneer of civilization collapses. And it's really about, I mean, everyone says, oh, it's about the rape. It's like, no, it's not about the rape. The rape's a metaphor for what happens when civilization fails and you're trapped in a situation where you can't control. That's horrific, that's terrifying. And that's what this film just shows in a way that's emotional, makes you feel it rather than having to have a post-apocalyptic language or landscape with the language of the apocalypse. The language is there within civilization and just going 30 miles out of your comfort zone, and it's still there. So this film is a horror of civilization collapse, and it's just like done in the most subtle way, and how it haunts you when you realise just how close you are to that kind of terror and panic. Number 4, Blue Velvet. Why is this not a horror film? This is another scary as hell film, and it's of course not a horror film because it's an art house film. Stephen Lynch art house film. It can't be a horror film. Oh, he only makes horror films with Lost Highway. It can't be horror. Yes, it's a horror film. I mean, Frank Booth is a horror character. He's terrifying. It's about the things that are below the surface that you do not want to admit to in yourself, and as you get older, as you grow up and discover sex and things, it's all about all that stuff and all the darkness within humanity slowly coming out and not quite understanding it, not quite sure how you're complicit in it. It's all that horror stuff, and it's great. But yeah, it's a horror film. It's totally a horror film. Other things too, but it's a horror film. I mean, horror does not have to be obvious. You should celebrate horror as what it is and actually bring it out and talk about it for what it is and not just go into simplifications. That's my main point of this video. Don't get into simplifications about horror. There's more to it, and it helps you understand some of these films if you actually understand they are partially horror films, but in a very interesting way, in a very deep social way that's going back hundreds of years of tradition. Okay, number 3 is a new one, The Menu, which the director more or less said it's not a horror film, which it is. It's about art and pretension and the horrors of someone who has gone slowly mad with trying to fit into society in a way, in the kind of civilized version of society. And it's like, yeah, it's a horror film. It's like when what you're asked to do to fit into society drives you insane, and you decide to trauma cult and take it out on the people who are doing the oppression to you in your mind, but you're also kind of a monster yourself. You've done it a monster by your attempt to fit in society and your attempt to be above society, and all the craziness that happens. That's a horror story. And the film's also a comedy, and there's lots of other stuff there, but that is the basis of a horror film. You know, and all the better for it because it's a really good film. Number 2 is Heavenly Creatures, another one about young love and the horrors we go to. Yeah, this is obviously a horror film. Again, there's other things too, but the kind of mad fantasies that they have, the two girls have in that film, are obviously showing you what's going on below the surface and some of the darkness below the surface. It is a horror film. It's just other things too, though, really. And there's a sense of course Peter Jackson's making it, he knows and understands horror. Like, Lord of the Rings, there's lots of horror in it as well. He loves horror. He was not going to suppress that in this film. It is very tied to Bad Taste, which is the film he made before it, which is also a horror film, which is zombies. And this one, it's the idea of British repression as it's expanded to New Zealand, which was tied to Britain. It's no longer tied to Britain, but it's still part of the Commonwealth. It's still a lot of its traditions and how it slowly drives people mad. So it's a horror film about Britain without being about Britain. And because it's not set in Britain, it can actually allows itself to be more expressive and more crazy. But it's still a horror film. Number 1 is Silence of the Lambs. This one, because it won Oscars, cannot be a horror film, even though it's got two monsters in it. It's got a leading lady who's trying to stop the monsters. It's every cliche of a monster movie. Anthony Hopkins is a monster character. I mean, it's like the only reason Manhunter is allowed to be called a horror film at times, but also a thriller, is because no one saw it in its release and everyone knows it's scary. This one, everyone knows it's scary, but it's respectable. Now, even though the director had cameos with Roger Corman and George Romero, and shot the dungeon scenes as dungeons, and actually had Anthony Hopkins play a character as a horror character, the director knew what he was doing. He shot Jodie Foster in a very horror movie way as well, even though the character had a lot of moxie and a lot of go, really, to find the villain and stop him. and there's a lot of psychological complexity, it's still a horror film. And a really good one. Just not as good as Manhunter. But it is a horror film. It's like, I don't get why it's not viewed as a horror film. But it is, so there you go. So I hope you enjoyed this list. I mean, I think the top one's obvious. So I don't want to spend tons of time on it. But I hope you enjoyed it and makes you think a bit more about what's horror and what's not. And how there's a lot more horror films if we actually expand our view of horror and actually have it as being something that's complicated and not just tied to schlock. Because Kubrick made horror. A lot of directors make horror because they know there's something there in it. It's just not the schlock side of it. There's other things there that you can go to. Some directors find themselves uncomfortable doing horror, but that's their problem. The talented directors who understand horror has been something interesting, make great work, like what I've just talked about. So, hope you enjoyed the video. That's me for now. Bye.